Hey folks, welcome to English 261 Week 12. This week I'm going to talk about the beat poets, and also this week you're going to read some contemporary poets, and you're also going to go ahead and work on what's called the found poem. The found poem is a poem that's similar to the cento and the cut-up, but instead of working from poetic sources or working from textual sources, you generally try and work from things that you just kind of, text that you just kind of come across in the world. So advertising, signage, found notes in the ground. There's all kinds of different ways you can do a found poem. But really the found poem is it's about just kind of finding texts as it exists in the world. So there's a lot of fun ways you can do these. So you can take, for example, take your notebook to the supermarket and go through a run through in the store and see if you just pick up words and things along those lines. Just watch signs as you're driving. If you're not the one driving the car, please do not try and take notes when you're driving a car. There's all kinds of different ways you can go about it. You can walk around your workplace, look at signs, things along those lines. There's all kinds of different ways you can write found poetry. But found poetry is really very much about just trying different kinds of ways of thinking and different kinds of ways of looking at and kind of different ways of arranging text based on what's just out there in the world and repurposing text in different ways. And to some extent it's kind of a beat project similar to a cut-up to some degree as well. So found poems are what we'll be working on this week. You should also be working on poetry analysis paper 2. This week though what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the beat poets. And the beat poets, generally speaking, the beats were a post-war era, post-World War II era collection of poets in San Francisco and New York City. And the group also included visual artists, musicians, novelists. As a matter of fact, some of the beats themselves are actually different kinds of artists. William S. Burroughs liked to paint. Jack Kerouac was a novelist. Ginsberg was very interested in essay writing, things along those lines. So the beats were a really kind of interesting group of post-World War II poets. And the reason I'm interested in the beats is the beats among 20th century poets tend to be remembered publicly. So for those of you who are considering teaching, or for those of you who are interested in the kind of 60s counterculture movement, the beats figure pretty heavily into culture. Whether their poetics were necessarily groundbreaking or very, very exciting, I think the case can be made for Ginsberg that his poetics definitely were groundbreaking and exciting. But they were definitely controversial figures in the early part of the 20th century, and they also in many ways contributed to the counterculture movement. The start of the 60s counterculture movement has its beginnings in the work and the thinking of the beats. And really what the beats valued, the beats valued challenging authority, questioning conformity, individual expression. They valued Eastern philosophies, even though sometimes those Eastern philosophies were not particularly well understood by the beats themselves or reappropriated in ways that were kind of questionable and suspect at times, but they did have an interest in Eastern philosophies. They also had an interest in spontaneity and genuine expression. And one of the reasons they were so interested in the idea of spontaneity and genuine expression is because they were really very much interested in jazz music, which is rooted in improvisation. As a matter of fact, jazz music was kind of very inspirational to the beats. And if you ever look at like coffee house cliches of people wearing berets and snapping their fingers to jazz music played behind poetry, that's probably in some way a cliche or a critique of the beat poets. But the beat poets were very kind of interested in spontaneity, genuine expression. They were kind of bohemian in a lot of ways. And to some extent, they considered themselves outlaw-like or living on the fringes of society. And they also, to some extent, though this wasn't necessarily espoused, they did often lead lives of incredible excess in terms of their behavior, in terms of their drug consumption and things along those lines. They tended to be kind of wild and out there on the edge. Characters like Hunter S. Thompson in some ways are drawing on the beat tradition and the idea of the inspiration of the beats. And the reason the beats partly were so popular is Part of the popularity of the Beats comes from the fact they were the exact opposite of what Americans were told after World War II were good Americans. And whether you realize it now or not, the 1950s and the late 1940s and the 1950s, the post-World War II era for the United States, were very much a time of incredible conformity. There was really much an expectation. This is kind of when we come up with the idea of the nuclear family, the idea that it's mom, dad, the kids living in the suburbs, consuming, buying new cars on a regular basis, living in houses on credit, buying things in credit, working at factories, in many cases for the military-industrial complex, for the support the idea of building up an arms race against Russia. And the 1950s is a really interesting time in American history because it's a time of incredible anxiety about how things are going in the United States, and a time of incredible anxiety as to fears of war with Russia, but also incredible anxiety towards fears of your neighbors, given the fact that we had McCarthyism. There was a lot of suspicion to anything that wasn't immediately patriotic and immediately rooted in some sort of deep American value. If you weren't a good churchgoer, you weren't going to the right church, you were looked at with a suspicion. If you were not playing your part in society, you weren't going along with the flow, there was a lot of suspicion towards you. And one of the things that happened is a lot of what happened after World War II is that instead of actually taking the time period to kind of recover as the nation kind of needed to do from things like the Holocaust and recovering from World War II and just the devastation that wrought, what we did instead was we very much said, okay, we're going to be perfect, and almost instantaneously that was the expectation for people. So women who'd actually had made great gains by being able to go to work in factories, had been supporting themselves since the men were off at war, they were immediately forced back into the house. That led to quite a bit of resentment. Minorities, men and women who had actually gone out into the workforce, same situation, were forced out and back into the home. Men were told, you're now a provider, you're now a family man, you're now going to work, you're going to buy this house in the suburbs, you're going to live this particular lifestyle. Despite the fact that a lot of them still had trauma from the war, they were kind of forced into these positions. And really, everything that didn't fit an idea that Americans were perfect, functional, good Christian people was in a lot of sense swept very much or forced very much under the rug. And rebellion, of course, was an inevitable part of this. And part of the rebellion was the Beatnik movement. Later on, which kind of became the hippie movement out of that during the Vietnam War. This was also the rise of biker gangs, and biker gangs were very much actually World War II veterans who came home and just said, we don't want this shit. It's not anything that's of interest to us. Most biker gangs were actually founded by World War II veterans, unless they came later along the lines. But the original biker gangs were World War II vets in most cases, or vets from Korea. So there's very much kind of pressed back against this kind of very oppressive culture. And then, of course, it was even nationalized on the level of McCarthyism, which was rooting out people that were considered to be communists. A lot of times it actually came down to rooting out people who just were gay or had different beliefs from the prevailing powers in America. And it became kind of a time of fear to some extent. And one of the ways that the Beats kind of responded to that, I fear, was instead of everything we do being planned, being controlled, being fitting in with some sort of great system, let's do things that are spontaneous. Let's do things that are wild. Let's do things that are genuine and expressive. And it was very much about breaking out of these patterns that had been established by American culture. And that's to some extent why the Beats were so popular. And it's part of the reason that the culture of the Beats and the things the Beats did were very much influential to the counterculture that came later once it kind of caught on as a widespread movement due to basically almost an entire generation's dissatisfaction with the expectations placed upon them to conform in certain ways, and also their feelings about the Cold War. One of the things that inevitably happens in any culture is if you build up a certain amount of pressure, it's going to eventually pop, and the way that pops is usually through either a cultural revolution or in some cases through an actual revolution, which is kind of an interesting cycle to look at through history. But in some ways, cultural revolutions are actually revolutions of thinking as opposed to revolutions of blood, which, generally speaking, if you're going to have a revolution, have a cultural one. They tend to be a little bit safer for everyone involved, though sometimes a little bit less effective, which is also the case of the 60s to some degree. But that's kind of what the Beat movement was really all about and what the Beats were interested in. So let's kind of go ahead and talk about the Beats in general, because I think they're an interesting bunch, and they're interesting to take because they had similarities across their across the group, but they also were very, very different in a lot of ways. And Diane di Prima was the first one I had you read. And Diane di Prima was actually one of the youngest of the Beats. And the reason I had you read Diane di Prima is I think Diane di Prima, she was not only one of the youngest of the Beats, she was also one of the women in the Beats. The Beats, in generally speaking, was very much a white male-dominated group of people. And it was partly the culture at the time. It was partly a lot of reasons just in the fact that poetry for a long, long time was white male-dominated. But Diane di Prima was very much recognized by the original Beats as a member of that group. And if you read her work, you kind of get a sense of why. Diane di Prima was a painter, she was a writer, she was also an activist, and she, along with kind of Allen Ginsberg, was one of the figures that really kind of was active not only in the Beat movement, but also very much active in the 60s counterculture. And she kind of spanned the bridge between the two. Some of the other Beats were not particularly interested in their kind of counterculture agenda once the 1960s rolled around, and we'll talk about those. Kerouac and Gregory Corso are good examples of people who just were not particularly interested in participating after that point, but Diane di Prima very much kind of got involved. Diane di Prima was very much a public figure during the 1960s counterculture movement and a kind of younger member of the Beats. And if you read the poems, it is perfectly clear that she is very much speaking to this whole idea of social revolution. Revolutionary Letter 3 is very much just tips about how to basically survive in some sort of situation where social order breaks down. Revolutionary Letter 2 is very much about the idea of the way that the idea of American individuality kind of separates us and forces us apart, and also gets people to live in fear of actually resisting authority, because if you're told you only live once, you have to protect that one precious life, and you can't give it towards something forward, which is kind of the idea of what she's talking about in Revolutionary Letter 2. And in Revolutionary Letter 1, you kind of get a sense, which is something that was also very true of the Beats, of being very confessional and very personal and talking about what you have, and seeing that you are a particular person. And it starts with and also one of the things that kind of comes out of the idea of the Beats is that the political and the personal are very much the same thing. Your political agenda and your personal agenda are very much tied to one another, and that was very much the case for Diane di Prima. You look at the first line, I have just realized that the stakes are myself. What she realizes in relation to her political stances is all she can give is what she is. And that's kind of very much a theme that kind of runs through the Revolutionary Letters, and also talking about these kind of larger social issues. And the Revolutionary Letters are there's quite a few of them, and they're a good read. They're definitely worth taking a look at. And in some ways, one of the things I think is worth talking about in the Beats is the Beats, by and large, are very, very inspirational. And they're very much about thinking about ways society could be changed, and thinking about ways we can resist things that make us unhappy in society, or resist the ways that society tries to box us in. And that has a certain kind of appeal to it. I think it has more of an appeal to people maybe when they're younger, but I still have a certain kind of fondness in my heart for the Beats, which is why we kind of look at them. I really like the Revolutionary Letters. I think Diane di Prima is actually one of the sharper writers of the Beat generation. Maybe not quite as experimental as the Burroughs, say, but I think she's kind of very lovely writer in a lot of extenses. Gregory Corso, The American Way is kind of Gregory Corso's, I think, it feels almost to some extent like a ripoff of Howl, I'll be completely honest with you. Corso was actually the youngest age-wise of the Beats, but he was one of the original kind of core group, which the original core group of the Beats was actually Ginsberg, Burroughs, and Kerouac, but Corso was one of those folks. Corso had an interesting life. He was very much he was an orphan when he was younger. He was in foster care. He was a juvenile delinquent and kind of a criminal, but he was interested in poetry. He was interested in art, and he kind of fell in with this group of other writers in New York City. And he partly fell into it because he was he actually was very much straight, but he was also very involved, and he worked for a number of gay nightclubs, which is kind of where he ran into Ginsberg in the first place. So Corso kind of fell in with the Beat writers and the poets. And Corso, out of all the Beats, I think he's might have been the one who lived the longest in general time. No, I think Burroughs actually lived the longest. Corso, I think, died before he did. But Corso was an interesting figure because Corso was probably not the best poet of the Beats, but he was a fun writer. He had some really interesting things to say. in the American Way, I think, is very much in kind of in line with the Beat style, and that style is very confrontational. It's very argumentative. It's very didactic to some extent politically, and I think the American Way kind of exemplifies that. The American Way kind of feels like Howl Light to me, and I like the American Way for a variety of reasons because I think it kind of puts up, and it kind of fits very nicely with the idea of counterculture sentiments, which Corso inspired, though Corso later on in his life was not really happy to be identified. He was not happy with the celebrity that being one of the Beats brought him. But he did continue to write, and he did continue to produce poetry that was very much in line with Beat traditions. And I think the idea of that the American and the American Way are two separate things, I think, is kind of what the American Way is all about. And I actually... I like Written the Eve of my 32nd birthday. I think it's a really kind of interesting meditation on growing up and realizing that that there's still life in you as you get older. And I think it's one of my and as I get older, I like Corso's these kinds of poems more than I like, say, his political work, because I think it's very kind of reflective of what it's like to kind of grow older, and I think it's kind of a quiet, lovely little personal reflection of that. But it's worth taking a look at both. Jack Kerouac's How to Meditate. Kerouac is mainly known as a novelist, and Kerouac was an interesting figure. Kerouac was probably the most famous of the Beats next to Ginsberg, and Jack Kerouac is partly famous because of On the Road and the story that he tells there. What's interesting about Kerouac is that Kerouac, while he's generally speaking the one most associated with creating the Beat movement, was also one of the first to walk away from it. And as a matter of fact, if you ever read Jack Kerouac's novel Big Sur, one of the things he talks about is how irritated he is by the people he's inspired, kind of looking at him as this cultural figure, because later, at that point in his life, Kerouac was miserable. He was extremely unhappy. He was depressed. He had a massive drinking problem. He was more or less destitute. And he was just deeply unhappy later on in his life. He was an extremely prolific writer, but he had a lot of different problems, and at a certain point in his life, he kind of resented his fame that he brought on himself by kind of coining the phrase the Beats and kind of writing On the Road and kind of creating a lifestyle. As a matter of fact, if you read On the Road carefully, there's actually a moment in On the Road where Kerouac realizes the lifestyle is actually unsustainable, and he in some ways resented the fact that people took it as gospel truth and kind of ran with it. But one of the things about Kerouac's poetry is Kerouac is not the best poet in the world. He's a pretty good poet in a lot of cases, but he's not by any means the best poet of the Beats. But I think his work is looking at, because it is very much in kind of keeping with Beat traditions in the terms of the spontaneousness, the stream of consciousness style of writing that you find in How to Meditate, and it's very also kind of tied to Eastern religion, which was something that Kerouac was deeply interested in. And also one of the things I think it's worth interesting in Kerouac's poetry has a certain edge of sarcasm and humor to it. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite poems he ever wrote, and I don't have it in here because it's in Desolation Blues, which is one of the books, is "If you don't like my poems, go jump in a lake." And I think it's a very kind of Kerouac way to open something. And this kind of ends with it's got kind of a little kind of quality of a smirk or joke to it I kind of like here. You fake it and it fades, and thought never comes, and with joy you realize for the first time thinking's just like not thinking, so I don't have to think anymore. And I think it's very kind of it's a very kind of Kerouacian end to the poem, and I kind of like that in that regard. It has this kind of humor to it. I think one of the things we tend to forget in poetry, especially when we write poetry, is you think it has to be deadly serious, and that's not always the case. A little bit of joke, a little bit of humor is actually completely fine, and we'll start seeing more of that as we start looking more at the contemporary poets who are a little bit less, take themselves a little bit less seriously, I think, than some of the poets we looked at prior. But How to Meditate's one I like. Bowery Blues is an interesting one, and it's very much about it's kind of got the kind of visceral quality that a lot of the Beat poets were into. And one of the things you'll notice about Jack Kerouac's line is Kerouac likes short, brief lines because Kerouac was heavily inspired by haiku. He really enjoyed haiku. He really enjoyed Zen koans and Eastern thinking. And even though at times he doesn't necessarily understand it, he used it a lot in his own work. And I think it's he's got these kind of sharp little lines here. And he was also not a huge fan of punctuation, kind of letting things flow together, so that stream of consciousness style of writing. If you've never read On the Road, it's an interesting read. Truman Capote called it just typing. I don't think that was a bit of a harsh criticism, because I think it was kind of an experiment in and of itself. But it's definitely worth taking a look at some point, especially if you're possibly in your early 20s trying to figure out what you want to do with your life and still have your wild years ahead of you, or if you're older, you're trying to recapture them. It's a pretty good read as well. So it's up to you how you're going to approach that one. William S. Burroughs is an interesting one, and Burroughs is the one that probably requires the most explanation in terms of his work. And that's because William S. Burroughs was probably the most on the edge of the beats. He was actually the oldest one age-wise. And Burroughs was an interesting figure. Burroughs was actually from a very respectable Southern family that had kind of fallen decrepitude. And he moved to New York kind of on the family dollar, and he was, out of all the beats, probably the most wild, though not the one we remember for being the most wild. Burroughs was a heroin addict. He was an alcoholic. He shot his wife in the head in Mexico City and fled from prosecution until somehow that just kind of quietly got hushed up and vanished. The police in Mexico City ultimately decided it was an accident. He shot her while they were playing William Tell with an apple and a handgun. William Tell is the game where someone puts a apple in your head and you shoot arrows at it. He did it with a handgun and killed his wife. There's questions as to whether or not that was an accident or not. But if you ever read, and I had you read America, the line where Ginsberg says Burroughs is in Tangiers and he's not coming back, it's sinister. The reason Burroughs is in Tangiers is because he shot his wife in the head. So it's not quite as sinister as Allen Ginsberg might have you believe. It wasn't the conspiracy he's kind of selling it as there, that he was run out for political reasons. No, he shot his wife. But Burroughs had some really out there ideas, and later on in his life he got really involved in mysticism and kind of science. And if you ever read Naked Lunch, it's one of those strangest books ever written, and it's a complete trip. And Burroughs really embraced the idea of repurposing text, because one of the things that Burroughs believed through a significant portion of his life was that language is the thought control device. And the way language is structured, Burroughs believed, and to some extent linguists will actually argue that to some extent what Burroughs has said was true, is that the way we think is very much influenced by the language we have. So the reason in 1984, for example, the government is so interested in controlling language is because if you can remove the possibility to think about something like a revolution, or remove the possibility to think about a society beyond the society you currently live in, immediately you stunted the ability of people to resist that society, because they don't have a language for it, so they can't communicate it, so they can't actually bring it into social action. And that was one of the things that Burroughs thought that language was doing, especially the corporatization of language, the way language is used by media. He thought it was very much designed to control us. And as a fact, Burroughs saw language as something separate from human beings. He thought it was almost its own entity within us, which to some extent mimetic theory would argue is true. Language propagates itself and actually works to some extent like a virus. Well, Burroughs to some extent kind of, at certain points in his life, kind of believed it really was a virus. He was kind of out there. But one of the ways that Burroughs thought about approaching language to kind of break up its control principles was by using cut-ups, which was juxtaposing texts that didn't necessarily fit with one another to kind of break up the associations in language, which is why Dead Whistle Stop Already End is very much an exercise in breaking up, taking language, cutting it up, repurposing it in different ways to kind of bring out new relationships and new connections in language and linguistics that are beyond what we get faced on a day-to-day basis, where everything is nicely ordered and put together. And Burroughs thought it was really important that we disrupt that use of language that we have. And it's definitely worth taking a look at, but he's very interesting. And Burroughs actually, along with a couple of the other beats, actually had faced pornography charges, had faced book banning, things along those lines. Naked Lunch was banned in the United States for a period of time and it had been banned abroad. Naked Lunch is a wild book. It's very, very crazy, but it's definitely out there. And Dead Whistle Stop Already End is there too. And one of the reasons that the beats, to some extent, in Burroughs included, faced a fair amount of persecution is because they were very, very open about gay sexuality. And homosexuality among men was extremely verboten in the 1950s America. It's still to some degree verboten today, much less than it was in the past. But in the 1950s, to be openly gay was almost unthinkable in the United States. Almost every gay man in the United States in the 1950s was closeted, because you'd find no acceptance, especially outside of major cities and small circles. But if it was known widely, you would find no acceptance for that whatsoever. And one of the things that Ginsberg and Burroughs talked about was they talked very openly about gay male relationships, and the Beats did that as well, because it was a hidden part of America that that was a thriving part of America. It was a hidden part of America, but it was underground. It was forced into criminality, and it was associated with criminality to some extent. Simply because of the situations where it had no space to flourish. Generally speaking, if you drive something to the point of criminality, it ends up associated with criminal activities, and that was the case of homosexuality to some extent. If being gay is criminal, and to engage in homosexual acts makes you a criminal, to some extent that puts you in a world of criminality. So it puts you in the situation closer to drugs. It pushes you closer to situations where you're getting involved in more suspicious behavior, because ultimately you can't express who you really are because you're forced underground by that. So it kind of puts you in these situations where there is really kind of a lawless setup. And that was kind of what was happening to some extent in gay clubs in New York in the 1950s and in San Francisco in the 1950s. There was a lot of drug use, there was a lot of criminal activity involved in those, because they were places outside of enforcement areas in the United States. So if you wanted to, if you were gay and you wanted to interact with the gay community, you had to kind of step outside the law to do it, and that put you in lawless situations, which ultimately is really unfortunate that that's what happens, but it does kind of create predatory situations where there's a lot of prostitution, things along those lines, and there's no real protection because the police either ignore it because they know it's a social situation that they don't want to step into, or if you can't bring police into it because if you did, people would be arrested and their lives would be ruined. So it was kind of a really unfortunate situation, but Burroughs and Kerouac and Ginsberg very much brought that very much to the surface, and they talked very openly about that kind of social environment. They talked very openly about homosexual men and the relationships they had, and they talked openly about sex and sexuality, and that kind of really ticked people off. So that's part of the reason they faced these charges, and Dead Whistle Stop Already End had this in it as well. And Burroughs also talked very openly about drug addiction, which was something that was also verboten in the time because Burroughs himself was a drug addict. So Dead Whistle Stop Already End is kind of an interesting thought exercise, also very much about looking at these hidden aspects of society that are pushed out of the language and ways to bring them into language in visceral ways. So I think that's kind of what you're running into there. I included Thanksgiving Prayer. I hope you enjoyed watching it. I think Thanksgiving Prayer is a fun... No, it's not really necessarily a fun poem to read, but it's very much in keeping with who Burroughs was. Burroughs had a very dry sense of humor. Thanksgiving Prayer is very deeply sarcastic in the sense of it's thanking America for all these horrible things it's done, and it's very much taking on the idea of jingoistic patriotism, the assumption that America, no matter what America does, is good, and Burroughs very much critiques that here. And the other reason I had you watch is because you get a sense of Burroughs' voice, and Burroughs had a very distinct voice. And if you found it, it's very memorable. It's almost like Tom Waits reading poetry. And I think it's kind of an interesting voice to hear because it's very high reedy but also gravelly. And he had an extremely distinct voice. It's so much so that REM actually asked him to cover Starmy Kitten, which he did once for them. And he also has read some of his own work, and that voice is very, very memorable. And I think Thanksgiving Prayer is interesting because it very much is in keeping with the Beats and how they saw that kind of jingoistic patriotic America they went into and they grew up in. So the last one I want to talk about is Allen Ginsberg. Allen Ginsberg was one of the leading Beats. He's probably the best remembered Beat, and he's probably considered the best poet of the Beat movement, which is kind of why I put him in the end. He's the one who tends to get anthologized out of all the Beats more than anyone else. And Ginsberg, he was very much involved in the 60s counterculture. He was one of the people who bridged that gap between being a Beat and being involved in the 60s counterculture. Burroughs did to some extent as well, but Burroughs got a lot weirder than the 60s counterculture, probably wanted to deal with, and also Burroughs left the United States at a certain point, spent a lot of time in England, and spent time in South America, and spent time in Tangiers and other places across the world. Ginsberg was very much a San Francisco fixture in the 1960s and was a major figure during that time, and was a major counterculture figure throughout his life. And Ginsberg, to some extent, was one of the stronger poets of them. As a matter of fact, Howl is kind of the poetic anthem of the Beat generation. I had you read America because I think America in a lot of ways is a lovely poem. It's not something you often find in the Beats. Is a sentiment of nostalgia and love for a country. A lot of the beat work is very much about what's wrong with America and how America's fallen and how America's ruined and how America's repressing everyone. And Ginsberg's America is more almost plaintive in the sense of America, when you be the America you promised you were going to be. And it's got a certain element of love in it and a certain element of beauty in it that I think is very, very powerful. Ginsberg was openly gay in his life. And that brought him a lot of difficulties and a lot of trouble. He also, unfortunately, got involved in a lot of other different things that caused him a lot of problems. He had some wacky beliefs, not quite as out there as Burroughs, but just socially acceptable beliefs. He had some really suspect ones. But Ginsberg, I think America is really kind of a lovely poem, and it has a kind of beauty to it, and a certain kind of recognition of just the language he uses and the way he describes things. There's something that feels very, very personal about it, but also very, very reflective of the nation as a whole. And I feel the same way about Howl. The way things are listed in Howl, the repetition is, it almost feels like a sermon, and it's an extremely memorable poem. I've seen the brightest generations in my mind. I mean, that's one of the classic lines of 20th century poetry. And the reason I have you read these, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves. I mean, that's really kind of extremely, very memorable. The angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and machinery of the night. I mean, Ginsberg had a really great knack for crafting a powerful line, and I think Howl is filled with these. And it's also visceral in a lot of ways, especially when he talks about gay sex and the gay culture scene in New York and San Francisco at the time here. It's very, very very much about bringing out the things that are hidden in culture and bringing them into the light, so people actually have to confront them, that this is too is part of your America, and this too is part of your nation, this too is part of our culture. Why can we ignore these things? Why do you repress these things, since these are part of who we are? And to some extent, a lot of the beats was basically announcing that I am an outcast in society, not necessarily because I want to be outcast, but to point out that you have made me outcast, and so I am this thing now that I am beyond you. And I think Howl has that kind of element to it. Howl is very defiant, but also very sad, and also very recognition of what's actually hidden in American society. And it has a quality of a howl to it, of someone yelling or someone screaming or someone expressing the wild things that are kind of hidden within a culture and repressed within a culture. And I think it's worth reading because it's a classic poem. It also faced obscenity charges, and it was banned, and it was restricted for a very, very long period of time in American culture because of how confrontational it is to the values of its time. So I think that's definitely worth taking a look at. All right? Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to cover for this week. You have a sense of what you need to do going forward. Next week we'll kind of take a look at the kind of some contemporary poets, and by contemporary I mean kind of coming into the 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and heading towards now. If you have any questions or concerns, let me know. Otherwise, take care, be well, and I'll talk to you folks again in about 7 days.